Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our forums are free and open to the public and are scheduled most Sundays at noon. We encourage you to attend. For more information about our forums, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. And we also have some forums on YouTube that you can look at. Our mission is to nurture the mind and spirit and serve social justice. Today I am very excited to be able to introduce Amy King, who will be speaking on medical cannabis. We have a member of our church, C.C. Castaneda-Williams, who had planned to speak with Amy, but she does have a serious chronic illness, and in fact that is part of her motivation to support the movement to legalize medical marijuana to control a lot of the side effects and pain associated with her illness. And this is a growing public movement, as you may be aware. Amy King, who will be speaking today, was educated by Americans for Safe Access, and she's a staunch medical cannabis patient advocate, and she legislates very actively and promotes in her home state of Texas and Pennsylvania for the legalization of whole plant medical cannabis. She is a medical cannabis patient herself, and she sees that the current laws are archaic and would even imprison her for the use of a botanical for a medical condition which may not respond to any other kinds of palliative treatments or pain reduction. She currently does reside also in the Yucatan in Mexico. So I want to go ahead and introduce Amy, and we thank you for being willing to spend time with us. Amy?
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Amy King, as she already introduced. I do live in Yucatan, Mexico, which is pretty exciting and fun, but we'll talk about that maybe another time. I came to talk to you today about medicinal cannabis because currently, this legislative session, 14 bills were introduced through the House and Senate that addressed medical cannabis in one form or fashion, whether it's decriminalizing the use of cannabis for certain amounts and citing you and releasing you for a traffic citation, small fine, to full repeal. David Simpson from Longview introduced a full repeal, pulling all of the mention of cannabis from state legislature. So we have this wide range of government agencies or government committees looking at the cannabis issue. Unfortunately, well, I guess I should say, we had two movements. One is a CBD only bill, a cannabidiol. This is a small portion of the cannabis plant. And my issue with this particular bill was that it's only being allowed for a small demographic. You have to have a child who has intractable epilepsy, who's failed a number of FDA drug treatments or medical surgeries, stimulator insertion, different medical treatments. Only then can a child have access to this. So it's beneficial for everybody. We should all have access to, at minimum, this cannabidiol. But I'd like to just explain to you today the history of how we got to where we are. Why is cannabis so controlled and other things are not? Cannabis sativa is one of the oldest agricultural crops known to man. It was cultivated as early as 6000 BC in China. And we know this because we have found remnants in urns along with burial sites We know that it was used, that some textiles were made from cannabis in around 4000 BC. Again, we're finding remnants of these products when we do excavations of temples and things such as that. In 2727 BC, we have the first recorded use of cannabis as a medicine, and this was from the Chinese pharmacopoeia of Emperor Shen Nung. He was a mystical emperor, and he was prescribing marijuana tea for the treatment of gout, rheumatism, malaria, and oddly enough, poor memory. Sorry, I got ahead of myself, but you can see they depict a picture of it, and then we're able to translate what his use of that was. In 550 BC, the Persian prophet Zoroaster, he gave cannabis the first place in the sacred text, the Zendavesta, which listed over 10,000 medicinal plants. In 100 BC, we know that the Chinese were making paper from cannabis and mulberry, and the psychotropic properties of cannabis are mentioned. This is the first time we see that. Around 600, the Germans, the Franks, and the Vikings were all making paper from cannabis, and they were using it for their maps. The drug's popularity as a medicine was, had spread throughout Asia, as we covered. It now was making its way to the Middle East, Africa, and in 1563, Queen Elizabeth of England decreed that landowners with 60 acres or more must grow cannabis as a crop, or they would face a fine of 5 pounds. In 1564, King Philip of Spain followed her lead, and he ordered cannabis to be grown from throughout his empire, which would cover Argentina to what is now Oregon. All of the European powers with settlements in the New World were particularly interested in growing cannabis, and laws were made stipulating if you were a land grant recipient who left your country and came to the New World, you in fact must grow cannabis to help support the naval forces of your country. All trade depended on cannabis as well. Cannabis was currency in the United States in the early settlements from 1561 to around 1763. In 1753, cannabis sativa was classified by Carl Linnaeus, and he had published a system for classifying all living things. He identified the cannabis sativa, which you can see is the tall one on the left, and cannabis indica is the short one to the right. There's a third one there, actually, and it's mostly grown in Russia. That's a Russian version. By the late 18th century, early editions of American medical journals recommended cannabis seeds, roots for the treatment of inflamed skin, incontinence, and venereal disease. And in around 1863, Dr. William O'Shaughnessy first popularized cannabis medical use in England and the Americas. He was a physician with the British East India Trading Company, and he found that cannabis, again, eased the pain of rheumatism, was helpful against discomfort and nausea in the case of rabies, which was pretty prevalent back then. Excuse me. They also used it for cholera and tetanus. In 1857, Smith Brothers of Edinburgh started to market an active extract of cannabis indica, and it was the basis for a number of tinctures, as you can see. America Druggist, Lilly, Park Davis, some of their still existent pharmaceutical companies today. In 1850, cannabis was listed in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia as a medicine for a number of ailments. In fact, what the United States dispensary said was the extract of hemp acts as a decided aphrodisiac. It increases the appetite, occasionally induces a cataleptic state. In morbid states, it's found to produce sleep, to allay spasm, to compose nervous inquietude, and to relieve pain. It says at that time the complaints to which it was especially recommended was neuralgia, gout, tetanus, hydrophobia, epidemic cholera, convulsions, chorea, hysteria, mental depression, insanity, and uterine hemorrhage. Which brings me to Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria's personal physician, Sir Russell Reynolds, prescribed cannabis for menstrual cramps. So he said at the time, when pure and administered carefully, it is one of the most valuable medicines we possess. Again, that was 1890. Back to the British Indian Trade Company. They were concerned because of the use of cannabis or hashish in the Middle East, where the British were setting up colonies. They were concerned that the use of this drug was slowing their slaves down. And so they commissioned a study to find out if this in fact was true. And the conclusions of that study from 1895, that cannabis had medical uses, it had no addictive properties, and it had a number of positive emotional and social benefits. We find a lot of these studies as we move forward. They want to prove one thing, and they find out that they actually prove the opposite. The sea of change in American attitudes towards cannabis came at the end of the 19th century, when about 2% to 5% of the population was addicted to heroin, unknowingly addicted to morphine, the secret ingredient in patent medicines that were being used, Golden Relief, and there was another one, the People's Healing Liniment. They used to peddle these around. So toward the end of the century, or the 19th century, we started to develop synthetic drugs like aspirin, chloral hydrate, and some of the barbiturates, which were chemically more stable than cannabis as a plant botanical was. The new drugs had striking disadvantages. Almost more than 1,000 people died from aspirin-induced bleeding in the first year of its creation. And so to prevent more of the country from becoming washed over with a morphine-induced golden relief, the government introduced the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, pretty basically creating the Food and Drug Administration. However, at the time, it didn't apply to cannabis. It merely brought the distribution of opium and morphine under a doctor's control. And the regulation of those chemical substances was a major shift in American policy. It was during the early decades of the 1900s we began to see individual cities and states implementing prohibition of opiates and cannabis as a means to discriminate lower social classes and migrants. There's overwhelming documentation relating drug use to violent and bizarre actions by the Mexicans, the Chinese, Native Americans, and post-Civil War slaves. And these types of publications are found very easily. This one's from the Florida Star in 1905. And it said, "Not long ago, a man who smoked a marijuana cigarette attacked and killed a policeman and badly wounded 3 other officers. 6 police were needed to disarm him and march him to the police station where he had to be put into a straitjacket." What we know about those kinds of stories is that they were pretty much created by a man named William Randolph Hearst. William Randolph Hearst had a very significant interest in timber. One of the problems that he ran into was he had 800,000 of acres seized by Pancho Villa. So this is kind of how we know that he had a axe to grind with the Mexicans, and so you can see, is Mexico nation locoed by a peculiar weed? Again, this is a real story that was posted on the Ogden Standard in, I think, 1919. So in 1916, recognizing that timber supplies were finite, the United States Department of Agriculture issued a bulletin number 404 that called for a new program of the expansion of cannabis to replace timber. In 1916, a process was invented that would turn the herds, or the long stalks of cannabis, into paper. So in 1917, the decortator was invented. It would break down the plant. It made it what used to be a labor-intensive industry into a mechanized or mechanical industrialized industry. And also at that time, in 1918, pharmaceutical farms were growing 60,000 pounds of cannabis for medicinal purposes. Let's see. We also had another study. I won't discuss that one. Again, we go back to the propaganda that was being sold is that cannabis was this very dangerous social plight that we were facing as a country, and that we needed to limit its use and access. You can see we went through the assassination of youth on marijuana. It claimed that you would have wild parties and different types of bad behavior. And in 1930, Harry Anslinger became appointed to a newly formed division called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. It was a subsidiary of the U.S. Treasury Department. By the way, Harry was from Pennsylvania. As you stated, we have a lot of history in Pennsylvania from that. But anyways, it was a subsidiary under the U.S. Treasury Department, and Harry's wife's uncle was the Secretary of Treasury at the time. He was Andrew Mellon of Mellon Bank. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So what we have is we have a new division in which the Treasury Secretary appoints his nephew-in-law to oversee. And so the Federal Bureau of Narcotics started saying there are 100,000 total marijuana smokers. Most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana usage. Marijuana, and this is actually quoted by Harry Anslinger, marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. So this was, it was horrific what was going on, what was being said, and at absolutely no time, absolutely no time did any of the surveys or reports or studies that they had conducted ever prove any of this. And, we had the 1894 Indian hemp study, the Panama Canal Zone report, which I blew by. The fact that cannabis was the third most common ingredient in patent medicines, regardless that the USDA had said that, cannabis is an important agricultural crop to our economy, to our supplies. Harry Anslinger still maintained that marijuana was an addictive drug that would produce insanity, criminality, and death. At the time, his goal was to prohibit cannabis, and they wanted to do this by implementing a tax use, again under the Treasury. And so they held these hearings. And scientifically, as I showed you, we had always known of the word cannabis. Scientifically, that is what it is, until we went through this transition of marijuana, which was a Mexican word. So they sent out the notices about this hearing for the Marijuana Tax Act, and nobody knew what it was. Nobody even bothered to show up, except the Americans Medical Association. Showed up at the last minute, unprepared, and he said, I prefer to use the word cannabis in preference to the word marijuana because the cannabis is the correct word for describing its plant and its products. The term marijuana is a mongrel word that has crept into this country over the Mexican border and has no general meaning except it relates to the use of cannabis preparations for smoking. At that time, it had been in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia for over 75 years and was found in 28 patent medicines. The American Medical Association opposed the act because the tax was imposed on the physicians who were prescribing it, the retail pharmacists who were selling it, and the medical cannabis cultivation or manufacturing facilities. Didn't matter what the American Medical Association said. The Marijuana Tax Act was put into place, and basically they never issued a single tax stamp. However, so we look at what was happening in 1937. DuPont had patented a process for making chemical plastics and making that from oil and coal, as well as they had designed a new bleaching process for making paper from wood pulp. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture says, we've got cannabis, we've got this new system, and DuPont said, yeah, we don't need that, we just made that stuff illegal. We've got a new bleaching process for paper, though, again, introducing more chemicals, more manufacturing processes. DuPont at that time advised his shareholders, again, anything I say that I quote can be found in record. DuPont advised his shareholders to invest in his new petrochemical industry, claiming the government would force the acceptance of these new industries. So what was going on at the same time was Popular Mechanic magazine declared that hemp was the new billion-dollar crop. And if you think about the timing of it, the new Marijuana Tax Act law had just passed, and Popular Mechanics was like, this is going to be our new industry. Unbeknownst to them at the time that was not going to be the case. Again, in 1941, Popular Mechanics revealed Henry Ford had built a car. They called it the plant. The car made from plant material. And it said, Henry Ford, here is the auto that Henry Ford grew from the soil. Its plastic panels have an impact strength 10 times greater than steel. They were made from flax, wheat, hemp, and spruce pulp. So again, you're going to look at what the industries were. The steel industry. They would have significantly been impacted had we been able to continue to grow cannabis as a fiber source. Oh, he also, when he drove up in his car, there's video of this. You can actually see it on YouTube. You can search Henry Ford's car, and you can actually see him drive it up. And he drove it up made with hemp oil gasoline. As we said, the Marijuana Tax Act pretty much stopped people from growing. And just until we got into World War II, and we were unable to secure textiles from different parts of the world as we'd been used to, so we had to go back to making our own. And at that point, you could apply for a tax stamp, but you had to get your seeds from the U.S. Army at that time. As soon as the war was over, they repealed all of the tax stamps that they had issued, and cannabis once again was in prohibition. So we know that we can get all of these items from just the general cannabis industrial hemp. We can get livestock, bedding, feed. We can build from it. There's a great new process with hemp called hempcrete, mold resistant, humidity resistant, pest resistant, fire resistant, and again, doesn't use extraneous resources. Let's see. The lie that won't die. We just don't know enough about marijuana. Despite the government's nearly century-long prohibition of the plant, cannabis is one of the most investigated therapeutic substances in history. To date, there are over 20,000 published studies or reviews in scientific literature that reference cannabis plant and its cannabinoids. Nearly one-third of those were published in the last 5 years. This was actually, studies revealed that cannabis contains in excess of 60 active compounds that likely possess therapeutic properties. The very first plant cannabinoid that was discovered was called CBN, or cannabinol. It came from a red extract of cannabis in the late 19th century. It was further elucidated in the 30s, and it was chemically synthesized in 1940. Second phytocannabinoid, or cannabidiol, that's the one we hear a lot about today, was discovered in 1940 by Adams and his colleagues at the University of Illinois. In 1938, Mayor LaGuardia of New York assigned the New York Academy of Medicine to investigate premises surrounding marijuana prohibition. He assigned a blue ribbon committee of 31 scientists from the City Department of Hospitals, and they did a clinical research involving 77 patients. It was a sociological study at the same time, and it was conducted by the New York Police Department. The LaGuardia report refuted claims that were made by Hearst and Anslinger that cannabis causes violence, and it cites all of the positive results. Anslinger responded by denouncing LaGuardia and threatened doctors with prison sentences if they continued to do independent research on cannabis. A key chapter in that report was by Dr. Samuel Allentuck, and it covered the psychiatric aspects of marijuana intoxication, again refuted the Federal Bureau of Narcotics' characterization that marijuana was an addictive drug. All of these studies were undertaken with the U.S. Department of Treasury's full good and knowledge, even though they weren't happy about it. I'll spare you the number of studies that were done between 1941 and 1973, but this is an important one, I think. This was actually one that was done in 1947 using children who had epilepsy that were institutionalized. So they felt that it was safe enough to, and not one child died out of that. In fact, what they found was that at least there were, 5 children. 3 responded at least as well as it did to previous therapies. The 4th became almost completely, and the 5th one became completely seizure-free. Again, the year was 1947. In 1945, Newsweek reported 100,000 Americans used cannabis, and in 1951, the United Nations Bulletin of Narcotics Drugs estimated there were 200 million cannabis users worldwide. That was the same year Congress passed the Boggs Act, and it for the first time named cannabis as a narcotic drug. So we're talking 1951 now. In 1961, our friend Harry Anslinger went and took his message to the United Nations, and it was at that time that new international restrictions were placed on cannabis, aiming to eliminate its use worldwide within 25 years. So in 1961, on the international level, cannabis was declared necessary to be eradicated. It just boggles my mind that we had all of those uses and all of that information, and they were just bent on removing it. Despite all of that, Harry Anslinger was removed under JFK. I don't know if that's significant or not, but he was forced pretty much to retire. And around that same time, 1964, a guy named Raphael Mechoulam, a scientist from Israel, started conducting tests in his laboratory. And they had these same international laws, but he was able to work around it. He actually got his government to issue him some cannabis, and the studies began. So let's just for a minute look at the social cost of the war on drugs. Billions have been spent fighting this war for the past 40 years. $33 billion in marketing programs to minimize drug use. $49 billion for police with special drug war grants that offer militarized weaponry in exchange for more drug arrests. These are actual contracts. And $450 billion to lock up people in federal prison. Half of current U.S. inmates aren't in prison for drug offenses. I want to switch to another one, kind of giving you a look at how we got there. Again, we'll just cover it. Was listed in the Pharmacopoeia from 1850 to 1941. It was the first, second, and third most prescribed med from 1842 to 1890. Covered all of the list of things we talked about earlier. And then we have the discovery. Let's see. 1964, Raphael Mechoulam was able to isolate THC, that's the Delta 9. That's the one that, we talk about that gets you high. In 1988, the first identification of a cannabinoid receptor in a rat's brain. We'll get to what that is. In 1988, they discovered these cannabinoid receptors, and in 1990, they were able to clone one. In 1991, they cloned one in humans. Now, this is pretty significant. They're like, well, what's going on? They discovered that we have this endogenous cannabinoids. We're creating something that actually is found in this plant. It's the exact same chemical compound. And so here back here they discovered that we had these receptors. What were those receptors for? And then they discovered that we started making our own. Then they realized we had a second receptor in our body, and they were able to start characterizing different activities of what these receptors and chemicals did. In 1995, the term endocannabinoid was coined, and that means basically something from within. And we're referring to the cannabinoids created from within the human body. They were able to identify a second cannabinoid that we actually create inside of our body, and they called that 2-AG or aracangyl. In the 2000s, they realized just how many cannabinoid receptors we had in our body, and they realized that the role of the endocannabinoid system was in a number of significant factors. Again, we go back to Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, and I think it's important to note in this case that Dr. Mechoulam was funded by the National Institute of Health right here from the United States for the last 45 years. And what he discovered and the process of which he went, Israel now has a fully national medical cannabis program. In effect, children use it, children who are battling cancer, all the way to seniors who have Alzheimer's or dementia. They also allow their active duty reservists to use it should they need it for their PTSD and previous service. And their medical marijuana program is also fully implemented using disabled veterans to prepare medicines for their country's program. They allow patients to smoke, vaporize in hospital rooms that are vented really well and have outside forced air. So the foundations, I'm not going to cover a whole bunch of the biology. I just want you to kind of get a feel for the fact that we know a whole bunch. Because you're going to hear a lot of our politicians will say, we just don't know enough. It's actually them who don't know, because we know plenty. CB1 receptors are located in several areas of the brain and in a variety of tissues, such as your adipose tissue, which is your fatty, your liver, muscles, your gastrointestinal tract, your pancreas, your gonads, and your sensory neurons. CB2 receptors are mostly located in immune cells. There are 3 types of cannabinoids, ones that are endogenously or made within. There are plant-derived, and then there are synthetic. I won't get into too much. I did write something about this. Our neuron pathways are usually one way. We take a medicine, and it signals that it should do something on a receptor basis. Let me make sure I get this to you right. Brain cells communicate with each other and with the rest of the body by sending chemical messages. These messages help coordinate and regulate everything we feel, think, and do. Typically, those chemicals called neurotransmitters are released from a neuron. They travel across a small gap, and then they attach to the specific receptor. In the endocannabinoid system, however, the messages are sent completely different because it works backwards. When the postsynaptic neuron is activated, cannabinoids, or the chemical messengers of the endocannabinoid system, are made on demand from these fat cells, and they are also already present in the neuron. So when they're released from that cell, they travel backwards where they attach to the cannabinoid receptor. Why is this important? Because cannabinoids act on presynaptic cells, they control what happens next. And so, again, we know a lot about the science, and we can even actually go back here. We can actually take it down to gene expression in the cell. I mean, it's so completely advanced. Right now, we have 24 states that have approved some form of medical cannabis. We have 4 states that have actually legalized cannabis for recreational use. We have limited scientific studies in the United States, and that's basically because of the federal restrictions that still remain on cannabis today. Cannabis is still designated as a Schedule I controlled substance with a high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use, and lack of accepted safety, even under medical supervision. Again, this is just covering the DEA's current schedule. The lowest that Schedule 5 is your over-the-counter prescriptions or any of your compounds with codeine, like hydrocodone. You get pretty simply at the dentist for having a tooth pulled. Number 4 would be your phenobarbital, your Libriums, your Valium. I mean, cannabis is still, way up here. The approval process for getting medical cannabis studies is different than any other drug in the entire United States, including heroin or morphine, ecstasy or MDMA or LSD. Those do not have to go through the same, even though they're Schedule I as well, they do not have to go through the same approval process. This really inhibits the research we're allowed to do. Again, when California approved its medical marijuana program by ballot initiative, they foresight enough of the legislative bodies to actually make a marijuana research act. So the number of the monies that were raised with their marijuana licenses were used to conduct studies. These are some of the studies that they did within the state of California outside of the federal process. Cannabis is one of the most studied drugs. We have a national repository called pubmed.gov. If you typed in the word hydrocodone, again, I use this because we're pretty familiar with hydrocodone, you'll see that there's only, let me see if I can, here, 739 studies. Now, this is in all of the scientific literature. This is a repository for every piece of scientific literature that has existed for medicine. So let me say that again. 739 total studies for hydrocodone. And yet, if we were using the word cannabis, 13,830 studies. If we looked up just THC, 7,888 studies. If we did THC in cancer, we're still getting 532 when we just narrow it down. If we look at the safety profile of cannabis, you'll see there's 27 studies versus the safety profile of hydrocodone. Again, we just don't know enough about it. National Institute of Health, I'm going to finish with this one. National Institute of Health is a part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. They are the nation's medical research agency making important discoveries that improve health and save lives. That is their mission and statement from their website. In 1999, the the department, or the National Institute of Health, applied for a patent. The patent number was 6630507. This patent said that cannabinoids were an antioxidant, and that as an antioxidant, cannabinoids could prevent the progression of Alzheimer's and dementia. I find this significant because their mission is to improve lives, and not a single person's life has been improved with this knowledge. They know it's safe, and they know it can reverse the progression of Alzheimer's. And the patent was issued in 2003, so we've gone over a decade. Our charged department has not improved anybody's life with this knowledge. And I think that we, as a society, should step up and ask questions about why we're not healing people, why we continue to, as a government, claim that that cannabis has no medicinal use. You can also look at procon.org. There are 60 peer-reviewed studies that they list in this particular article that cover everything from ALS to Tourette's syndrome. That would include rheumatoid arthritis, glaucoma, multiple sclerosis. So there are a number of health benefits that we're absolutely certain can be found in cannabis. And that's basically what I wanted to share with you today. So I hope you were able to get some good, valuable information.
We have some questions from our audience. James Bryce.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. I'm fascinated by this. My dad died of prostate cancer 40 years ago and begged me for marijuana, which I found, and it helped him dramatically. What have gotten more and more interested in is to see how these things happen, where we have a resource here that has been suppressed, apparently primarily for economic reasons, just like we have other resources, fuels that have suppressed the development of green energy. Is it primarily, in your opinion, an issue of economics and interest that prevent this from being taken care of?
I absolutely do think so, because as we move forward with medical cannabis legislation, we see more and more restriction away from home cultivation. Like, for instance, David Simpson's bill says cannabis shouldn't be treated any different than a tomato plant. Okay, I mean, the law doesn't prevent you from sharing your tomatoes or your lettuce with your neighbors. However, it does have restrictions about how you would regulate that if you were to take it to market. But we should all be able to have that, and we're seeing less and less and less and more demand that they be pharmaceutically standardized. And one of the things we find with cannabis is that it's not a standardized medicine. One size does not fit all. And that's based on everybody's individual makeup. Like we said, we can take this down to the cellular level. Good question.
We have a question from Peter Ty.
I guess this is a political question. I've heard on NPR the other day that there's sort of an unholy alliance where Republican legislators in New Hampshire are willing to liberalize the use of marijuana, and the Democratic governor and Democrats don't want to, in part because it gives the Democrats a chance to sort of look tough and get along with the police. And so while Democrats would supposedly be more liberal, it's part of a political game being played. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I do think that when you're in a democratic process and you have organizations like police unions that are funded so significantly with the war on drugs. Again, we're getting into a whole realm of social implications when you have forfeitures and where, the person doesn't even have to be convicted of a crime. They just have to claim that there was some relation to drugs, and while the person is either in jail waiting for a trial or even found not guilty, they've been removed from their homes, all of their assets have been seized, and we find that that's a very unfair system. and it encourages this type of continued approach to the drugs that are being used today. Good question, though.
We have a question from Douglas Bauer.
Good presentation, Amy. All medicines have side effects, and cannabis, when viewed as a medicine, will also have side effects. And the question really is, do the benefits of the medicine outweigh the available side effects? Could you comment on what you consider the most significant side effects of cannabis?
I think the most significant side effect of cannabis is fear of using it and being arrested. We see that there is some paranoia, that people don't necessarily want to be elevated outside of their comfort zone, so that can be traumatic for people that use it, but I don't find that it's any more significant than the opiates that we use today. But we see side effects that are increased appetite, so you got to have a good steady supply of things to eat, and you may get a little drowsy depending on which strain you're using. But again, nothing life-threatening. You're not going to have organ failure as a result of using this botanical. Based on what I'd shown you earlier, the different areas of the brain that have it, the one part that we don't have it in is the brainstem. The brainstem controls respiration, body temperature, and there are no cannabinoid receptors in there. So no matter how much you consume, eat, smoke, rub on your skin through a topical, you are never going to fatally overdose. It's impossible to happen. So I don't know that there's, like I said, the significant bad things would be the paranoia that can come with that. And I also want to point out that there is an addiction tendency. The numbers that we're sure of is 9%. So 9% of the population could be considered to have a substance problem with the use of cannabis, meaning they're unmotivated, it affects their work, their home life. But in all of the drugs comparatively, nicotine, alcohol, prescription meds, sugar, caffeine, sex, it falls in the lowest scale. Again, only 9% compared to 23 to 37% in some of the other categories. So we still find that it has a really good safety factor, that the majority of people won't be becoming addicted to the point of problematic. Hope that answers your question.
We have a question from Elizabeth.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Yeah, and so I read that your talk, you're working to get a legalization of whole plant medical cannabis. So in the states that have legalized it for recreational use, is that also happens? Like they can do medical research, say Washington, Colorado?
Yes, actually Colorado has also set aside part of their proceeds are supposed to be allowed to do that research. Dr. Sue Sicily, you may have heard, recently was in the news. She wanted to do a study on PTSD use in veterans, and she worked for the University of Arizona. She had applied for a grant. She went through the arduous approval process for marijuana, finally got approved, and they fired her. Well, she went to a couple other colleges and universities, and they were like, yeah, we're not going to touch you. Even though she had this money already, finally, the University of Colorado actually stepped up, and she's able to move forward with that PTSD study. Again, she's still going to continue to do that in Arizona, which we're really excited about. But, yes, they are allowed, and I think that as we come back, we're not going to pass any medical cannabis bills in this state, this legislative session. So we have 2 years to move forward, holding education forums like this, trying to inform the public. And with that education, we can expect to get better bills. we want to, Texas has a very significant history and discoveries of things, and I think it's time that Texas get on board with all of our research institutes here, and we had some recent testimonies about that at the hearings in the committee level. Myra Crownover is holding up 3785 from the Health Committee. She will not allow it to go to a vote. It has to be finished for a vote by tomorrow. And then if she even voted it out tomorrow, it would not be heard in the Calendars Committee, and so therefore it's dead in the water. And that was an intentional holding up. She did pass through the cannabidiol only right out of committee. So
we have a question from Martha Schumacher.
I will make it simple if I can. Big Pharma is the problem. You did not say that. But here is my question. We pulled up a whole list of all these, at least 2 or 3 dozen things that this cannabis can help. So I'm kind of surprised that one little weed like that picture can, and even Parkinson's. Could you comment on why it is? I mean, I have a simple mind that one little plant can cure 2 or 3 dozen types of problems.
Sure, because we are able to create and secrete these chemicals in our body on our own. That's part of evolution. I like to use a little thing that says stoners and hippies didn't invent that. Something bigger than me and anybody else who's used recreationally have ever done. So we're creating them in our bodies. What we know particularly about Alzheimer's and the dementia is that you have a plaque buildup. There's a plaque buildup that happens in Alzheimer's, and the cannabinoid system literally secretes its chemicals that dissolve that plaque. There was recently a study done by an Ohio State University researcher, Dr. Work. You can look him up. I think it's W-E-R-K. And he said that the people who were using cannabis in the 1960s are not the people you see with Alzheimer's today. So they not only can suggest that the government's patent can stop the progression of it, it can actually prevent the presentation of it too. So we are learning that down to the cellular level, but particularly for the Alzheimer's, we dissolve a plaque. There's a plaque that causes Alzheimer's. In the cannabinoid system, chemicals dissolve that plaque. Yeah. Absolutely, it's a neurological.
Well, I think we have to. There may be some illnesses which marijuana may be able to prevent or cure, but I think we're talking also about curbing unpleasant side effects and pain in a number of chronic illnesses, and that's where I think most of the research has been, not cure, at least at this point. We have a question here. Would you say your name and stand?
Hi, my name is Monica Mota, and I just wanted to ask you, what do you feel about as far as the difference between the oil and and then smoking? Well, and I can just say, I think that the oil is more potent and is more medicinal. And then I also wanted to touch on, because what he said was about about cannabis, and I mean, I think anybody, it could be abused, but that could be anything. Absolutely. You can abuse anything. I mean, you can abuse aspirin, So,
and we do.
and so I think that the focus needs to be on education versus not talking about it and not then staring like just not talking about it and just confront it and just say it So that's what I just wanted to say about that. And then so I just wanted to see what you thought about that.
First of all, cannabis is coming in a multitude of delivery methods now. It's not just that you have to roll a joint or smoke a bowl. There are products, full extracted cannabis. That's where they use a solvent to dissolve the cannabinoids They evaporate that solvent away, and they leave behind a very thick, resiny material. That resin is used to fill in capsules so that you can take it by mouth. That same resin is used to, it's dissolved in vegetable glycerin so that you can use a sublingual tincture. That tincture can also be used in a vaporizer. You can take your plant material, and you don't even have to roll and smoke a joint anymore. They have vaporization, an FDA-approved medical device even, for vaporizing your cannabis, which means there are none of the carcinogens or significantly less carcinogens because you're not actually igniting the plant material. You're heating it to a certain temperature and vaporizing it. That's one that they use a lot in Israel. They have cooking. You can put it in. You can take and make oil, coconut oil, olive oils, and use it for cooking. We also take some of the cannabinoids and can make suppositories as well. So there are a number of topicals, sprays for your mouth. I could go on and on about all of the different. And the interesting thing is many of these things can be made at home.
Well, we want to thank you for this presentation. I'm sure that this topic is going to be the focus of a lot of research and public discussion in the next decade or two, and it's going to be exciting to find out what the results of all of that are. Thank you, Amy King.
Thank you guys for having me. Thanks for the great questions, too.